In this video I will go over the plot of episode 4, discuss some historical points, and then review the episode. The episode starts with Edward praying with the battle going on outside. The Godwin invasion of the north was a diversion, and Edward had sent most of his army there, leaving him vulnerable. Emma says to Edward, in effect, "I told you so." Harold, who is the driving force behind the Godwins' return, bursts into the room, demanding to know where Edith is, and saying he doesn't want to unseat the king because it would cause instability. Also, he mentions the Northern Earls, one coming to help the king. A terrified Edward is in his mother's arms. Moving on, Harold rescues Edith and discovers he has a new daughter, Freya. He also has another daughter and a son called Magnus. Harold demands Edward have an heir, as does Gunhild, Edward's wife. Gunhild and Emma argue. Emma wants Edward to name an heir who can do what Edward could not, and that is destroy the Godwins. William has set a trap for Henry, the King of France. The barons did their part, but Henry got away. Silward has passed, and Harold wants Tostig to be Earl of Northumbria, but Godwin wants Sven to be Earl of Northumbria because Sven needs to be kept busy and out of trouble. Harold says it's up to the Earl of Wessex, i.e. himself. Baldwin reveals to Matilda that if Henry is dispatched, then he will be guardian of Henry's son, therefore William has to play his part. Baldwin is also annoyed about being used to pass on false information to Henry, and Matilda is annoyed that Baldwin was still in contact with Henry during their exile. William and Matilda plot Henry's demise. Tostig marries Judith in England, and Sven, having fought for the Godwins' restoration, is also back in England. Harold names Tostig Earl of Northumbria at their celebrations, and to honour the agreement with Silward, so when Silward's grandsons are old enough, Tostig will stand down. Godwin is not happy about Sven being passed over, and Sven is not happy about Harold's rise to power, circumventing himself. Sven tells Tostig that he must remain useful. Godwin is ill with either fever or some form of flu because he is coughing a lot. He wants Harold to give Sven something to do and some position, but Harold says no. Godwin tells Harold not to make Sven his enemy. Gunhild insists to the royal treasurer that she wants to know what money Emma has taken out of the treasury and what it has been spent on. Meanwhile, Harold wants to protect Alfred the Great's legacy, and he sends Sven on a long pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Gunhild informs Edward of the missing money, and he is upset with Emma, removing a large sum of money to pay Hardrada for an army to make Hardrada king and to wipe out the Godwins, and he confronts Emma over this, and Edward and Emma argue, and she berates and taunts him for being weak. Emma then beats her to her demise. Judith, who is Tostig's wife, is pregnant. Baldwin gives Matilda intelligence on Henry's whereabouts. The show has Gunhild, Edward's wife, as a strong woman, and she tries to seduce Edward in order to produce an heir. William and Henry duel, and William dispatches him. The treasurer tells Gunhild some information. She then rides off after the messenger, whom she dispatches after getting the message. She then rides to Harold and gives him the message which she obtained, and the message is that Edward wants to make William his heir, which surprises Harold. Godwin's illness gets worse. Harold tells Godwin that he sends Sven on a long pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and of Edward's promise to William of the throne of England. Godwin speaks of Danish invaders and Norman kings, and that you can't trust the Normans. Harold trusts William and states that William does not want the throne. Godwin says that the people will not accept a foreign king, and there will be war. Godwin insists Harold become king. Godwin then passes away. Harold promises to become king. In Norway, an English messenger sent by Emma arrives with a message for Hardrada, which states that Emma, the wife of Canute, says that Canute's promise stands, and that anyone who united Denmark and Norway will be King of England. Starting with the battle scene and the Godwin restoration, with Harold being the driving force behind their return. Now, Godwin wasn't idle in his exile either, I should note. Now, Harold and his brother, Leofwine, did raise a force of 9 ships in Viking Dublin. They raided Portlock in the southwest of England. They fought a skirmish where 30 Thanes perished. They then met their father, Godwin, in the Solent, before the combined force under the Godwins raided the south coast. When the Godwins landed at Pevensey, they were met with popular support. Edward also had an army in the south, in London, and wanted to fight, but no major battle was fought, because on both sides, elements wanted to avoid a civil war, and they negotiated a peace. Godwin swore oaths, and the Godwin family were restored in full to their positions. While there were raids and a skirmish, there wasn't a large battle. Now, to be fair to the episode, you only hear a battle outside where Edward is. You don't actually see it, so you don't actually see the scale of it. Now, moving on to the army sent to the north. Now, historically, there was no army sent north. Now, Edward was politically weak, not having a power base of loyal retainers or a permanent standing army, and was reportedly quite pious and later made into a saint. But from what I've read, I don't think he was quite as mentally weak as presented in the show. Now, Harold, he did have a son called Magnus, but he and his wife Edith did not have a daughter called Freya. His children with Edith the Fair or Swan Neck were Godwin, Edmund, Magnus, Gunhild and Githa. Maybe also Ulf, although there is debate as to which Edith the Fair or Edith of Mercia, which one of these was his mother. Now, the demands for Edward to have an heir, that's fine because of the need to carry on the dynasty, and as the Godwins had hoped, an heir with Godwin blood would serve their interests. Now, Emma was retired by the stage of the Godwin crisis, because Edward felt bitter towards her for marrying Canute, prioritising her son Arthur Canute over Edward. He thought she didn't do enough for him, and after Edward's coronation, he and the three earls turned up, stripped her of her lands, and confined her to a nunnery. She was released from the nunnery, but her career was over. Emma may very well have had some blame towards Godwin for her son Alfred's demise. Both Arthur Canute and Edward certainly did. Now, regarding Edward dispatching her, this did not happen, because she was born in circa 984 or 985, and she was in her mid-60s at the time of the Godwin crisis, and indeed she passed away in March 1052, and it is far more likely to have been old age and not by Edward. Also, Emma did not take a large amount of money to give to Hardrada. First of all, she had no power to do so, and secondly, when Edward became king in 1042 and was coronated in 1043, she reportedly preferred Magnus the Good, who was the king of Norway at the time, and she wanted him to become king of England. Now, Magnus wrote to Edward, threatening to invade England due to his agreement with Arthur Canute, in which whoever passed first would inherit the other's kingdom. On a side note, this very agreement actually freed up Arthur Canute to invade England with 62 ships. Now, although no fighting took place because Hereford had passed by this stage, Arthur Canute then became king, and he reigned for 2 years. Now, Arthur Canute passed first, so Magnus considered pressing his claim to the throne of England, but he got caught up on campaign in Denmark, first sacking Jomsburg and destroying the Joms Vikings. He hammered the Wends at the Battle of Leirskau Heath, and defeating Sven Estridsson in Jutland. Harald Hardrada was in Constantinople at the time, in 1042 and 43, and he only returned home to Norway in 1046. Now, it was Tostig, following his exile in 1065, that he went to meet Hardrada in 1066, and convincing him to invade England. Now, as a renowned Viking leader, taking up his nephew's Magnus' vague claim, and one last chance for glory, from his perspective, well, why not? I should also note that Hardrada never united Norway and Denmark, not through a lack of trying. He ravaged Denmark every year between 1048 and 1064. In 1049, Sven's army was too frightened in facing Hardrada, and they fled by jumping into the water to escape. On another occasion, Hardrada escaped Sven's clutches by tossing the loot that he had gained through a raid in Denmark into the water to distract the Danes, which it did, much to Sven's distress, because the Danes were more concerned in getting the loot rather than pursuing Hardrada. Now, at the Battle of Nyssa, even though Hardrada was outnumbered 2-1, he was able to capture 70 Danish ships, with Sven jumping into the sea to escape. In the end, however, an agreement was reached in which Hardrada recognised Sven as King of Denmark. Now, William trapped Henry in this episode. In the 1054 campaign leading to the Battle of Mortimer, where the French army was widely dispersed while ravaging the land. Now, William then pounced, and the battle was hard fought, but William won. Now, in 1057, at the Battle of Varaville, part of the French army was separated from the main French army when it crossed the river, and they were then cut off, and they were destroyed when William attacked them. William did not slay Henry in personal combat. It is true, though, that Baldwin V was guardian of Henry's young son Philip. The episode has Siward passing just after the Godwin Restoration in 1052. He actually passed in 1055, and that's when Tostig was appointed, who certainly would not have considered himself a caretaker earl, and he did not leave his position willingly. The North rebelled against him, and despite Edward wanting to fight, Edward was convinced by Harold, who negotiated with the rebels and came to terms with them, and upon the advice of the Witan, agreed to these terms and sending Tostig into exile. And as mentioned earlier, it was Tostig who convinced Hardrada to invade England, not Emma, and who had long since passed at this point. Siward was survived by his young son Wulfiof, not her grandson. The decision to make Tostig Earl in the show was Harold as Earl of Wessex. Considering Harold's power and Edward's lack of it, it is plausible, but Tostig is also thought to have been a favourite of Edith, the king's wife, and of Edward himself, so he may not have been entirely down to Harold. Now, Canute made no agreement with Hardrada because Canute was determined, and he did establish his North Sea Empire in order to pass on to his sons. Indeed, Hardrada was wounded and sent into exile in the east after his older brother, St. Olaf's defeat and perishing at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. The agreement being referred to may be the one between Harthacnut and Magnus in 1038. Now, Tostig marries Judith during his exile in Flanders, not in England, and it is not known whether Tostig's two sons were his sons with Judith or from a previous relationship. The names are Scully and Ketel, which are Anglo-Scandinavian names, but Tostig himself was of Anglo-Danish ancestry. The show has Edith, Edward's wife, as a strong woman, and from what I've read, this is true. She was also ruthless, being linked to the assassination of Northumbrian thanes who were opposed to Tostig, but her dispatching a messenger is likely dramatic effect. The issue of their childlessness was either down to non-consummation of the marriage due to Edward's piety, or revenge by not wanting an heir with Godwin's blood, or their inability to have children on either Edward's part or Edith's part. Either one of these is plausible. Now, reference Sven. He did not take part in the Godwin Restoration, nor did Harold send him on a long pilgrimage to get him out of the way. Sven went into exile with the rest of the Godwins in 1051. He then went, at this point, on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and he perished in 1052 when returning from Jerusalem. Harold did have issues with Sven over his abduction of the abbess of Leominster and of Sven dispatching his cousin Bjorn, and he disagreed with his father Godwin over having Sven restored and pardoned. On Harold's naivety with William being his friend and not wanting the throne, friends at the top of medieval politics is unlikely because they are in pursuit of certain agendas which would make this difficult. Harold and William are not recorded to have met in the 1050s. Now, William's 1051 visit to England, per the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is likely to have happened during the Godwins' exile. Now, although William freed Harold from captivity in Poitiers, and William knighted Harold for his efforts in the 1064 Breton campaign, William wanted something from Harold, that is, Harold's oath to make William king. It was a transaction. Now, whether this oath was under duress, because Harold was on William's turf, surrounded by William's knights, and his brother Wulfnoth and his nephew Hakon were being held captive by William, and also the point of whether Harold knew of Walter, Count of the Vexin, the older brother of Ralph, the nephew of the Confessor, and his wife passing conveniently in 1065 while prisoners of William. Now, on the promise to William, it is not clear as to whether William was really promised the throne per the Norman sources, who are really pressing William's agenda and quite biased, or whether there was something vague that was mentioned about the kingship, or whether this was fabricated Norman propaganda. Whichever the case, William believed or convinced himself he was Edward's rightful heir and was the rightful King of England. Harold mentioning William not wanting the throne is wrong. Now, Godwin's illness in the show is incorrect, because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that on Easter Monday he sank to the footstool, bereft of speech and strength. He was taken to the king's room and he lingered until that Thursday before passing. Most likely this is referring to a stroke. Other suggestions are that he was poisoned, or that he choked on a piece of bread while protesting his innocence in regards to Edward's brother Alfred's demise. Now, Godwin speaks of Danish invaders and Norman kings, and that you can't trust the Normans. Now, the Danish invasion of 1016 and the conquest of England at that time is what made Godwin the power he was, because he integrated himself with Canute. Firstly, because Godwin had been loyal to Edmund Ironside in his campaign for the throne, and Canute himself prized loyalty. Godwin went with Canute to Denmark in 1018 and 19, even leading a night attack against the Wends, whom Canute was campaigning against, further earning Canute's trust, who then made him Earl of Wessex in 1020. Now, Godwin also married Githa, whose brother, Ulf, was married to Canute's sister Estrith. Godwin did lead the anti-Norman faction, and following his return, most, not all, of the Normans and other French at Edward's court were exiled. Godwin mentioning the people will not accept a foreign king and that there would be war. Now, the English did accept a foreign king in Canute, initially not universally by choice, because he did have to fight Edmund Ironside in several battles, and in the end he won England by conquest on the untimely demise of Edmund Ironside's passing, because the agreement after these battles was that whoever perished first, the other would become king. Now, Canute was a ruthless and pragmatic king in gaining the support of the English church, and by becoming King of Denmark, he stopped the Danish raids of England and ensured his popularity. Now, Harthacnut, Canute's son, with Emma, was effectively a Danish king because he had spent most of his life in Denmark, and he was king of England for 2 years. He was not popular at all, and he was remembered rather unfavourably. Now, Edward had spent 25 years in exile and was a stranger in his own land, and Harthacnut and Edward did not cause war upon their ascensions to the thrones. Now, reference William, he did win England by conquest and war, and there were numerous rebellions against William in the early years of his reign that were brutally crushed, and that the Anglo-Scandinavian elite were either wiped out, sent into exile, or reduced in rank. So, to an extent, about war and not accepting foreign kings is true, and perhaps the mentioning in the show is Godwin foreshadowing events to come. This scene, however, is almost likely taken from Edward's own deathbed warning about enemies overrunning the country within a year of his demise with fire and sword. So perhaps they're actually giving Edward's speech to Godwin instead. Now, it is not clear when Harold started eyeing up the throne of England. In the early 1050s, at the time of the crisis and the Godwin's return, it is still possible, providing everything worked in that department, that Edward could produce an heir. Now, if not, there was his nephew Ralph the Timid, and he passed in 1057, but he had a son who was also called Harold, who would have been 8 or 10 at the time of Edward's passing. Edward the Confessor brought back his nephew, Edward the Exile, who was a son of Edmund Ironside, but he unfortunately passed within days after returning to England in 1057. He had a son called Edgar, who would have been about 14 at the time of Edward's passing. Edward had no direct heirs in terms of children, but he did have heirs in terms of his, in this case, grandnephews. Now, when Edward passed, both his grandnephew Harold and his grandnephew Edgar were too young. They had no effective power base of their own, and they had no support at the start of 1066 because of the need for a warrior king. Upon Harold Godwinson's demise after Hastings, there was limited support for Edgar, and he and the remaining nobles submitted to William, but he would later rebel against William, specifically in the north, and the different rebellions against William were uncoordinated and defeated in turn. Now, turning back to Harold, he could have started eyeing up the throne in the early to mid 1060s. As Edward's health declined, the youthfulness of the prospective heirs, and upon learning of William's intent on the throne of England in 1064, or some combination thereof. So that's what my opinion is, that it started to come to the fore in the 1060s, rather than that in the 1050s. The show doesn't really know what it's doing. I mean, last episode you have Harold saying he wants to usurp the king and Emma's position, and at the start of this episode he doesn't. The drama is flat and uninspiring. The plot is all over the place, as is the history. I mean, I do get that fiction stretches history to varying degrees, and it has varying degrees of tolerance for it. But they've jumbled things up so much, and they've got so much wrong. It's ridiculous. The visual effects of the cities so far is bad, and I'm not looking forward to the CGI of the battle scenes in later episodes, or what else they combine or condense in historical terms. In summary, so far, it is a bad show. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.